Hi and welcome back to the channel. Yes, I'm doing science fiction again because I know the subscribers like it, and to be honest with you, I like it myself. So I'm doing 3 different science fiction movies, one from the 30s, one from the 50s, and one from the 1960s, and I'm going to do them in that order. So let's get started. There aren't really many 1930 pre-code science fiction comedy musicals out there. Now, by pre-code I mean before the Hays Code came in the early 1930s and totally infantilized American cinema for a number of decades. But this one exists, and it's a little thing called Just Imagine from 1930, starring Elle Brendel and Maureen O'Sullivan, who later went on to play Jane to Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan, amongst many other things. I think she's also Mia Farrow's mum, but I'll check that and let you know right here. Yes, she was Mia Farrow's mother. Yes, she was Mia Farrow's mother. Now, this movie from 1930, that makes it 92 years old as I'm recording this. And it looks 92 years old. The copy I was able to get is pretty sketchy. But I persevered because it is part of cinema history, and it's kind of interesting as well. It's set in the far distant future of 1980, and at the start of the movie they compare 1880, 1930 and their perceived 1980 just to show how things are very much different. In this 1980 future, people have letters and numbers instead of names. The government determines whether you can marry somebody or not. There's a touch of really dodgy eugenics in that. And people fly in little personal aeroplanes, which is kind of nice because we haven't got flying planes in any real sense yet. And there are lots of other wonderful innovations like food pills. Babies come from vending machines on the street. And there's a plan to go to the planet Mars. There's an ingenue pair who are star-crossed lovers because the court determines that they can't get married unless he does something spectacular in his field of aviation. And because it's a musical, there are some really kind of ordinary singing and dancing numbers in this movie. It's not at all accomplished from that point of view, but it's really interesting from a couple of other ones. Into this far distant world of 1980, a man who is struck by lightning in 1930 gets resurrected.
You were struck by lightning in 1930. This is 1980.
By science, and there's some really great use of Kenneth Strickfaden's electronic gadgetry, which was later used about a year later in a little film called Frankenstein. We get to see some of Strickfaden's really beautiful neon and electronic gear being used to kind of simulate the machinery which resurrects this guy. Now, the character who is resurrected is a kind of Swedish immigrant caricature played by an actor called Elle Brendel, who did a vaudeville act about this kind of a character. He, of course, has a name, but decides he's going to give himself a number to stay in place with everybody else. So his name becomes Single O. Yeah, it's that kind of humour. But there are some really interesting little bits of satire in this film as well. You have to lean into it to really understand them. But there's some satire about the Volstead Act, which was the Prohibition Act that came into place in 1919. And in this far future world of 1980, they still haven't got rid of Prohibition, which makes it fun. There's also a really interesting and sharp satire about Henry Ford, because all of the brands of flying cars that people have Jewish names. There's a Pincus, there's a Goldfarb, there's a few other different Jewish names which are used as the brand names for the flying cars. Single Zero makes a joke about that because Henry Ford was well known to be anti-Semitic. So there's a little bit of social satire in there really nicely. The Prohibition gets satirized, that gets satirized. One of the songs in the movie is called An Old-Fashioned Girl, which satirizes that kind of nostalgia for the past that a lot of popular music at the time had. There's some, the movie does punch a little bit, which is kind of interesting, and I like that. So Single O, the hero and the hero's best friend, end up going to Mars. They have a really groovy rocket, which may well have been reused for Flash Gordon and a number of other things, because it's got that look about it. So they land on the planet Mars and are taken before the Queen, who is kind of interesting looking. She looks like a nightclub singer. The production design of the Martian scenes owes a lot to the 1924 Russian science fiction film Alita. The interesting thing is, everybody on Mars is a twin. And on one side of the conflict, in one nation is one twin, in another nation is the identical twin. So the second queen that the guys meet on Mars is the evil queen. Now, there's another bit of really interesting casting and really interesting choice here as well. Because the Queen's main guard, the first queen they meet, her main guard is a big burly guy with a really weird hairstyle, who is clearly gay.
She's not the queen, he is.
He takes a shine to Single O and they become buddies, and Single O flirts with him. You've got to remember, this is pre-code and they could kind of allude to being gay in the same way that Al Jolson's movie Wonderbar does it. And the interesting thing is, even though there's a little bit of kind of snickering about it, it's not really pejorative about the gay character, which I found fascinating in this film. So they end up on Mars, they escape the bad nation of evil, warlike twins, and come back to Mars with some proof that they'd gone to Mars. The hero then has become very accomplished and is able to marry Maureen O'Sullivan's character. Now, this isn't sophisticated movie making. You've got to remember, this film's 92 years old. It is not going to be Denis Villeneuve's Dune in any way at all. But it is on a continuum from the silent movie era to modern science fiction. And they really do some nice stuff. The production design is beautiful from what I can see, given the sketchy print that I've got. A lot of it owes a little bit to Fritz Lang's Metropolis. But they did go to the effort of making a giant set in an aircraft hangar. There are some interesting fashions in the modern world that they have from 1980. They have taken science fiction a little more seriously than I would have expected, within the context of a very light and frothy kind of comedy. And I like that. I like the fact that they roll social satire in with some kind of inclusionism, as we would see it now, and some really carefully thought out innovations. So for some science fiction fans, it's going to be a little bit of a hard ask for them to lean into a movie like Just Imagine. But it is part of the genre's history. And if, like me, you love science fiction, you're going to make the effort of checking this one out, because it is a lot of fun. It's got some crazy stuff in it. The songs are eminently forgettable. And Elle Brendel's kind of mock Swedish character kind of grows on you, even though it is very much a caricature. And Brendel himself was of Scottish, German background. So he wasn't Swedish in any way, but he did have Central European ancestry. But I found it really amusing. It worked for me because of that satire as much as anything, and because of the fact that the production design really did try to do an imagined future correctly. If you haven't seen it, you probably should, but it's not going to be loved by everybody who sees it. The second film I've got for you is a kind of lesser 1950s Universal Studios giant monster movie. It's one I hadn't seen before, but I got it in a double feature box set from Umbrella Entertainment, which also has the Monolith Monsters in it. And in fact, it's got a kind of very loose connection to the Monolith Monsters in a way. It was directed by Nathan Duran, who made a whole bunch of really interesting genre films after this one. And I've got a list here. He made 20 Million Miles to Earth, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Jack the Giant Killer in 1962, First Men in the Moon, and in 1973 he made The Boy Who Cried Werewolf. So he was very much grounded in genre work. After he made this movie from 1957, which is the Deadly Mantis. The Deadly Mantis infuriated me because right at the start of the film, this movie infuriated me at the start, but it won me over eventually. The reason it infuriated me at the start is there's 7.5 minutes of stock footage and titles at the start of the film setting up the radar installations that America had in the US and Canada during the Cold War. The idea is that a giant praying mantis, about 150 to 200 foot long, is thawed out of the ice of Greenland and starts attacking bases in the far north of Canada that the US has set up to watch out for Russian missiles. So it pissed me off right at the start, but then we start getting into the story and then it starts getting a little more interesting. So that brings us to the guy who's in charge of all of these bases, played by Craig Stevens, who a couple of years later turned up in Peter Gunn and became famous as Peter Gunn, the Private Eye on television. His girlfriend in the series was played by Lola Albright, who was in The Monolith Monster, so there's the connection between the two movies. He investigates some of the bases which are smashed to pieces and there's no visible sign of the people who were stationed there, and he finds some mysterious footprints in the snow and the ice. Second time it happens and a plane is attacked by something. They find a giant claw about 5 foot long stuck in the fuselage of the plane, and there's a nice little jump scare when that is discovered. They take it back to Washington, and some scientists, including William Hopper, the son of Hedda Hopper, who turned up as Paul Drake in the Raymond Burr Perry Mason television series a few years after this, is a paleontologist who discovers that it's actually a part of an insect. And so they slowly build up their evidence that there's a giant praying mantis flying around North America, attacking things and eating people for food. It's a patently absurd idea, but they kind of run with it. And the very stiff leading actors put it across okay. Craig Stevens was never a great actor. William Hopper was never a great actor. So they're relying on the concept. Now, the thing that surprised me and the thing that won me over in this film is the fact that the praying mantis puppet they use is pretty damn good. It looks good. They film it well. They film it at nighttime partly to kind of hide the artificiality of it. But there are some scenes where it's very effective, particularly when it's flying around. When you see it flying around, there's some really interesting motion blur on the wings, which is the right way to do it. And they put across the motion blur really effectively. So that makes it seem more realistic. And they're careful about the way they shoot it. You do see it climbing up the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., which is kind of interesting, where they probably got a real praying mantis to do it or something like that. But the monster itself is more believable than the acting of the leading characters in this. You can tell the movie was made on a fairly low budget, and they tried to put as much of the budget as they could into the monster rather than everything else. So they do rely on the stock footage all the way through the film to give us the military operations to try to get rid of this giant bug. Now, there are a few nice attacks on the bug too. There's one while it's still in the Arctic where some guys go at it with a flamethrower, which I really liked. It's not perfect, but it's a good, honest effort at showing a guy with a flamethrower attacking a giant bug. And there are some other scenes where the monster is attacked by missiles from jets, and eventually it lands and hides in a tunnel leading to New York City. It says the Manhattan Tunnel, but there's no such tunnel in real life. So the wounded giant praying mantis hides in this road tunnel. The army blocks off both ends of it with giant tarpaulins and pumps smoke into it to keep the insects sedated, and then they go in with basically poison bombs to kill it. Now, given the fairly limited budget on this, they do it quite well. The giant bug laying over a whole bunch of wrecked cars really sold it for me. It works well. There's a little bit of an attempt in the movie as well to do a love triangle between a female photographer and the two leading men. But you get the idea pretty much from the start that William Hopper's character is not interested in girls. Whether that's just a modern perception I'm putting on the character or not, it's the way it plays to a modern audience. So Craig Stevens ends up with a girl, the giant insect is killed, and some poor bastard from the sanitation unit has to find a way to chop up a giant praying mantis and remove her from a major road tunnel. That would have made an interesting film. I would have paid money to see that one. In spite of its limitations, I think The Deadly Mantis is a bit of fun. But you've got to get past that first 7.5 minutes to be able to get to the interesting stuff. Very much plays out with the standard giant monster template of a 1950s Universal movie. But it kind of worked. I'm a little bit more happy with it than I expected to be. And particularly than I expected to be while sitting through all of those shots of planes flying across the Arctic and people in bulldozers shoveling snow. So if you haven't seen The Deadly Mantis, you might want to check it out. But maybe fast forward 7.5 minutes in and then go into the story, because you don't need to know the details of the 3 layers of radar that the US had in the 1950s to warn them that a whole bunch of Russian missiles were going to attack. Yeah, that stuff's totally irrelevant to giant insects. But they put it in there anyway as a propaganda piece because they had cooperation from the army to make the film. So they obviously had to chuck in a bit of "this is your tax dollar at work" kind of propaganda at the start. But it really does make the movie drag. But I've left the best for last. The third movie I've got for you is a Czech film from 1962. In English, it was known as Voyage to the End of the Universe. They did a cut-down version of it for American audiences in the 60s. But the proper name for it is Ikarie XB-1, which, as I said, is a Czech science fiction movie. It's in black and white like the other 2 movies I've talked about today. And it's based on a story by Polish science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem. And it's really interesting. It's about the first voyage to Alpha Centauri by a ship. It's set in about 2600 AD, and an international crew of 40 men and women travels at a significant fraction of the speed of light, heading to Alpha Centauri. It's going to take about 14 months subjectively for the ship to go there and back, but while they go there and back, 15 years will have passed on Earth because of time dilation effects. We see this effect on the crew at the start, where one of the crew members' wives, who was supposed to be on the voyage, fell pregnant and wasn't able to travel because there's a lot of G-forces at the start and it wouldn't have been good for the baby. So she stays behind and they talk while they still can on a giant video screen and kind of talk through the implications that she's going to be older than him by the time he gets back, and they're going to have a teenage child by the time he gets back. So they kind of really ground this with some human drama right at the start of the film. So the ship travels and they do an interesting thing. There are some puppies on board the ship, and we see the passage of time because the dogs get older as you see them further and further into the film, and I really like that. I think it's a nice visual representation of the passage of time. There are some things that happen on the ship. There are marriages that occur, there are romances that occur, there are people looking after the older crew members. There are other issues. There are kind of flirtations. There are people who try to get the food computers to make absurd foods. There are dinner dances. So basically there's a whole society on the ship. It reminded me a little bit of Aniara, the modern movie based on the Scandinavian poem. It's got a little bit of that feel about it, and gives us a really interesting look at a society, a micro society on a ship traveling through space. And it does it in a really fascinating way. Obviously it was made during the Soviet era, so they were under control of Russia. And it's got a kind of utopian Soviet feel a little bit about it. There's no hierarchies really on the ship. Everybody's got their specialities and people get together to make decisions that will affect the ship itself. So there is very much a kind of egalitarianism, which makes it feel a lot different than an American movie of the same kind. There are a couple of adventures that occur on the way. The first one is that the ship encounters another ship from the 1980s, which they find adrift in space, and its reactor's about to overload. There's a lot of radiation on it. It's a very dodgy ship to be around. And they find it's an American ship which got lost in deep space. And it's really interesting how they slip in some propaganda. You see the corpses of the crew have been gambling, and they have fistfuls of money clutched in their dead fists. And it's a kind of a ghost ship in a way, and it does have a creepy feel about it before the reactor overloads and the ship explodes. The other thing is they encounter what they call a dark stubble, which is actually a black hole. And a couple of the crew are out on the hull of the ship doing some repairs as they approach a previously unknown black hole, which has some previously unknown radiation, which causes radiation sickness in the two crew members who are on the surface of the ship at the time. And it also has an effect on the rest of the crew. They start getting tired and sick, and eventually they realize that all of them are going to be in a coma for at least 60 hours while they pass this black hole and the effects of it diminish. So they're not sure whether they're going to come out of it at the other end. So there's some real drama there. It's like there's two different episodes of Star Trek locked into this pre-Star Trek movie. Now, the movie's marvellous. The production design is fantastic. The sets are really great. The costumes are pretty good as well. The special effects for the spaceships are effective. And because it's in black and white, they can light them in such a way that you can't see any strings or anything like that. And it's got that interesting Eastern European 1960s design about it, which you see in other things like a whole bunch of Russian Fantastica. And it's got a little bit of the similar feel to the 1960s German science fiction series Rom Patrol. So it's definitely got a different look than American science fiction movies of the 50s and 60s. Ikarie XB-1 was recommended to me by a number of people on previous comments on the channel. And thanks to all of the people that recommended that. I hadn't seen it before. For some reason, it had never really crossed my attention. But this is good, honest science fiction, and has a very optimistic and utopian ending about it, which I really appreciated. The antagonisms between people are caused by one guy going kind of mad from the radiation poisoning, and he becomes a threat to the ship. And also the things they encounter along the way. There's not really antagonism between the people on board the ship in any kind of macho pissing contest kind of way. And a social optimism. I mean, it is somewhat utopian in a way that predates Star Trek's utopianism. And I really liked it. I think it's an important piece of science fiction cinema from the 60s that doesn't get enough love. I mean, everybody talks about 2001 with this giant space baby and its monoliths and its really great special effects. But in a movie like this one, there's a little more meat on the bone than something which is very kind of barren and austere and nihilistic as 2001 is. And I appreciate it for that. I think it's probably one of my favourites this year so far. It's a non-science fiction movie which does a lot with not a particularly big budget. It shows trust in imagination. It shows trust in the original intellectual property upon which it's based. And it gives us an interesting look at another culture's idea of the future. And that's never a bad thing to look at. So that's about it for this time around. I think I would, if I was going to grade the three films, I would go number 1, Ikarie XB-1. Number 2, Just Imagine, for its fun and its satire. And number 3, The Deadly Mantis, because it's not as good as other movies of its type made by the same studio, but it still has some features of interest. So all three of them are worth checking out. Let me know if you've seen them, and let me know what you think of them too, and whether you have a different spin on them than I do. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please think about liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. You can hit the notification bell too. If you're really nice, you'll support the channel with a donation at patreon.com/paleocinema. Next week, I'm starting to do the list of the top 10 of the 31 movies I put out to the subscribers and to the audience, asking them which movies I should review. I'm going to do the first 3 of those movies and tell you what the winning movies are in the next video. And that's going to be a lot of fun going through them too, because the votes were really interesting, and some of the movies I wanted to be at the top of the list weren't at the top of the list. Some of the movies I wanted to be at the top of the list were at the top of the list. Anyway, look after yourselves. Stay safe. Watch some good old science fiction movies. Watch some bad old science fiction movies. Try some old science fiction movies that you really wanted to see but haven't seen before. And I'll catch you next time.